$27.4 billion to Pakistan, $22 billion to Angola, $7.2 billion to Sri Lanka. China, one of the world's economic superpower, lent to over 98 countries. And as the debt mounts for these countries, China seems to be having a field day. Why is that? And why did China seem as a viable option to the developing countries as compared to the IMF or the World Bank? How did the Red Dragon financially entrap countries in the Indian subcontinent with its Belt and Road Initiative? And how did India avoid itself from being trapped by China's debt trap but still is under risk? This video will tell you all about it. The World Bank, Harvard Kennedy School and Kiel Institute showed that China's bailout loans accelerated between 2016 and 2021. Since 2002, China has spent over $240 billion, which by the way roughly is the GDP of Sweden, as bailout loans for 22 countries. According to the World GDP data of 2022, the United States ranks top with the GDP of $20.89 trillion, and China comes right after it at $14.72 trillion. But if we look at China's economy just about 30 years back, its GDP was $360.86 billion. China amped its economy across agriculture, foreign trade, manufacturing, technology, tourism, and online shopping between the 1960s and 2002. As China opened itself up to the world of investments, it was stringent on one fact that it won't change the country's one-party system. China became increasingly more and more ambitious to become the world's superpower, dethroning the United States and the hegemony of the West, which held its status since the fall of the Soviet Union. Soon, China began lending to countries to support their infrastructure, rail and ports, or the Belt and Road Initiative. China has faced a lot of backlash from the West for its lending practices. It accuses China of lending to poorer countries and leaving them burdened to repay hefty debts. But Beijing has rejected this narrative by the West, and it says that there isn't a single country that has fallen into the so-called debt trap. But is that really the case? Between 2007 and 2014, China lent $1.26 billion to finance Sri Lanka's Hambantota port. And unable to pay its debt, coupled with hefty interest, Sri Lanka was left with no choice but to sign off the port to China on a 99-year lease. And such is the story of the East African country Djibouti, that has access to the Suez Canal and sits at the entrance of the Red Sea. China has been building ports here. In early 2018, Djibouti officials bought in state-controlled firm from China. And barely 5 years later, the East African country is now home to China's first ever overseas military. And it owes China about $1.5 billion in debt. So, here's the catch. China doesn't publish any of its foreign record of loans, and majority of its contracts have a non-disclosure clause. This prevents the borrower from revealing that information. China argues that it is a common practice to maintain confidentiality for international loans. According to the World Bank data, this graph shows the rapid growth in China's reported lending as compared to the IMF, Paris government, World Bank. If you look at China here, the graph has moved significantly upward since the 2006. So are Chinese loans more difficult to repay? China does tend to lend at a higher interest rate as compared to the Western governments. And the time to repay a Chinese loan is less than 10 years when compared to the 28 years that other lenders offer. So far, Pakistan is the country that has borrowed the highest amount from China. According to the 2021 data, these countries held the biggest debts to China. Pakistan has borrowed $27.4 billion, Angola has borrowed $22 billion, Ethiopia has borrowed $7.4 billion, Kenya at $7.4 billion, and Sri Lanka borrowed $7.2 billion. But amid this business of lending, it is interesting to note that China spent $240 billion to bail out countries under debt. Beijing says that this comes as an initiative to deepen friendly trade relations. And most countries that received a bailout loan from China were part of its BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, also called as the New Silk Road Project. is about connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe via land and maritime networks. The ultimate aim is to increase trade, improve regional integration, and overall economic growth. In the past 2 decades, China has handed out bailout loans to over 22 developing countries. Most of these countries are under the BRI. Argentina received the highest amount of $101.8 billion, followed by Pakistan at $48.5 billion and Egypt at $15.6 billion. Some experts like Carmen Greenhart, a World Bank economist, said that China is trying to rescue its own banks, due to which it is getting involved in this risky business of international bailout. India has so far steered clear of taking loans from China or entering itself into the BRI deal. But China's looming threat at India's neighboring countries can't really go unnoticed. In 2022, China landed its ship at Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, a high-tech Wongyang 5 vessel. This ballistic and satellite tracking ship was seen as a security concern for India, as the ship's satellite tracking abilities could be used to spy on India's security system. However, China did argue that the ship was meant for scientific research, but even the US's Defense Department said that the ship is under China's PLA and is capable of tracking satellites and firing missiles. China leased the Hambantota port in 2017, and earlier in 2017, it also signed a lease with Pakistan to take over its Gwadar port for 40 years. Amid this, concerns were raised that China might take a lease on Bangladesh's shipping port. This move will give China an unprecedented access across India's immediate neighbors. This puts New Delhi in a tough spot on how to navigate its relations with these nations to keep China looking across India's borders. So, India is wary of China's nudge around its border, and it will leave no stone unturned to not fall into its conniving traps. But as far as the debt-ridden countries are concerned, loan repayment looks rather grim to the developing countries who are trying to cope with pandemic and inflation.